Next we come to the third of the mental aggregates, or the fifth of all five aggregates, depending on how we count. This third of the mental aggregates is called sankhara kanda. Sankhara means to form, to make, to produce. This aggregate is essentially the thinking. When something has been perceived and recognized and classified, then there arise concepts about it. This concept formation and thinking is the sankhara kanda. This is very important because sankhara kanda is the cause of our various actions and deeds. The things we do arise out of our thoughts. Even to come here to Suan Mok, you had to have the thought of going or coming to Suan Mok. This is how sankhara kanda leads to our various actions. And so if we don't control this sankhara kanda, if we allow it to become the basis of attachment and selfishness, then all kinds of dangerous deeds can arise. Sankhara kanda is the cause of our various good deeds, wrong deeds, right deeds, incorrect deeds, harmful deeds, beneficial, wholesome deeds, and so forth. All these activities arise out of the aggregate of conception, or sankhara kanda. Sometimes sankhara kanda gets so busy, it kind of takes over and dominates the mind, to the point that we can't even sleep at night and go crazy with all our thinking, where it can't stop and just drives us insane. So sankhara kanda needs to be kept under control, otherwise it can cause a real mess. This is the aggregate of conception, the fourth of the five kanta, or aggregates. Next we come to vijnana kanda, or the aggregate of consciousness. This aggregate of consciousness is the basic consciousness of the objects that contact the various sense apparatus. So it's consciousness of forms, consciousness of sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and so forth. There are these 6 avenues of sensory consciousness. And this basic knowing of the different objects which make contact with life, this is called vijnana kanda, or consciousness aggregate. Sometimes we can call it a kind of awareness, but we shouldn't confuse it with the feeling, or the feeling aggregate. This is more of a knowing, just to know whatever object it is that makes contact with life, with the mind. That is consciousness aggregate, and it functions on the 6 sense bases of eyes, ears, nose, and so forth. This is the basic consciousness on which the other khandas can arise. Without this consciousness, the other khandas wouldn't be able to function. So this is very important. It's also the most subtle of them all, and it's the one we tend to overlook the most. But even so, it can still be the basis of attachment, the I am conscious, or my consciousness. And so we attach to even vijnana kanda, this very fundamental knowing that is the basis of all experience. This is vijnana kanda. It's the last, the 5th of the 5 aggregates, or the 4th of the 4 namakanda, the 4 mental aggregates. So these are the 5 ingredients of life. In life, one of these khandas is functioning in every moment of life. And we ought to know which aggregate is functioning right now, which khanda is working at this moment. We ought to be aware of this, be mindful of this. There are these 5 khandas working in life, performing their various duties. And they are all the same in that each of them serves as the basis of attachment. They can all be the foundation for the feeling of I, for the sense that I am, that this is mine, this is myself. This kind of regarding things as I and mine is always established upon these 5 khandha. And so they're all the same in this way. If we were to phrase it the same way that Descartes, the French philosopher, put it, we might say that because I feel, therefore I exist. Or because I perceive, therefore I must exist. Or because I think, I am thinking, therefore I am. Or I am able to know things visually, orally, and so forth. Therefore I exist. Even with the body, because the body is able to do its various functions, we would say, oh, the body does this or that, I exist. This is merely foolish or ignorant workings of the mind, ignorance establishing itself and clinging to one of these 5 functions of life, one of these aggregates, as the self or as something that belongs to self. And as soon as that happens, it grows, it develops into selfishness, which is the cause of all kinds of dukkha and suffering. So if we understand this, if we examine and get to know these 5 khandha and see how they become the basis of attachment and selfishness, then we will start to understand how to become free of the pain and suffering that arises from selfishness. In the Pali language, there is a very easy way to express this, and we'll see if we can translate it into English. Pali can express it in a very natural way. It phrases it very naturally, that shows how it's just all a naturally occurring process of natural phenomena, nothing but nature. When something can grow, because it grows, we call it form. This is the form aggregate. Because it grows, when something performs this function, we call it form. Because it feels, we call it feeling. Because it regards or classifies, we call it perception. Because it thinks, because it conceives, we call it conception. And because it cognizes, because it is aware, because it knows the sense objects, we call it consciousness. There are just these 5 functions, and we give them the different names: form, feeling, perceptions or discriminations, conceptions, and consciousness. Depending on the different function that is taking place, we give it a different name. We give it a name according to one of the 5 khandha, or aggregates. There are just these 5 functions taking place. The different elements are conditioned into this or that function. And so this function occurs, and then that function, and this function, and that function. And each of these functions can take place without there having to be any attachment to them as I or mine. They happen already. They can happen and function completely well, very smoothly on their own. There doesn't need to be any identification with them as I or mine. They don't have to be clung to or regarded as I, mine, or myself. There are just these 5 functions, and we can give them the various names accordingly. But there is no need at all for the ignorant attachment to them as I and mine to turn them into selfishness and suffering. So now we come to a fact that is very important. We have our own personal conventional truths, or another word for it is our own foolishness and stupidity, which we take to be the truth. And this is that as the five khandhas are functioning, we are constantly attaching to that function as I or mine. When the body functions, when Rupa Khandha does its job, there arises the thought, I am doing this or that. When there is feeling performing the function of feeling, we think, I feel. When Sanya Khandha perceives, regards, and discriminates, then we think, I perceive, I regard, I discriminate. When Sankhara Khandha conceives of thoughts, we think, I am thinking, I am conceiving. And when Vijnana Khandha knows the various sense objects, we say, I am conscious. I cognize these sense objects. Because of our because our minds are trapped under this, what we take to be the truth, but it is based in foolishness, in ignorance, we attach to these five functions. We say, I am doing this, or this is my body, my feeling, my perceptions, my conceptions, my consciousness. And we do this, we turn all of this into suffering. Buddhism boils down to a very simple fact, that whenever there is attachment to one of the khandhas, then there is suffering. There is some pain within the mind. And when there is no attachment, then there is no dukkha, there is no suffering. But because of our fundamental ignorance, our lack of understanding of how this works, we're attaching to these khandhas all the time. I am this, I am that, I do this, I do that. Over and over, this ceaseless attaching to things as I or mine is constantly brewing up suffering, dukkha, within our lives. Buddhism, the heart of Buddhism, if you're interested in learning what Buddhism is about, comes down to just this one fact, that when there is attachment to something as I or mine, then there is dukkha, suffering. And when there is no attachment, then there is no dukkha, no suffering, no pain. This is what Buddhism is about. We hope that you will be interested in this teaching. We hope that you will be interested in studying the five khandha, but studying them as things that we don't have to go and attach to. Studying them as things that are not self, not I, and not mine. If you do so, this can liberate life from dukkha. This will be the end of today's lecture. We have been talking about selfishness. We've discussed how dangerous it is for the individual, how dangerous it is for society, and how very dangerous it is for the world as well. And then yesterday we explained the cause of selfishness and then the foundations on which selfishness stands. Today, we would like to talk about how to get rid of selfishness. So we will be discussing the way to end selfishness. As far as stopping selfishness or ending selfishness, we can see that sometimes it ends by itself. Selfishness arises, runs its course, and then ends by itself. This kind of ending of selfishness has nothing to do with our ability, our skill, or knowledge. It just runs its natural course and then ends. But there is a different way of ending selfishness that is our own activity. We take some action, some skillful, wise action in order to end selfishness, and then it disappears. And then there is a third choice, which is even better than the first two. This is to prevent selfishness, to not let selfishness be born, and then we don't have to put it out. This prevention of selfishness is even more cool and peaceful than having to get rid of it once it arises. But in the end, it's another way of ending selfishness. So there are three ways of ending selfishness. One, it ends by itself. Two, we do something to stop it once it has arisen. And then three, we can prevent its arising in the first place. We'd like to remind you about the new life. The old way of life, the old common way of life, is filled with selfishness. We'd like to remind you about the new life that is free of selfishness. We've been warning you about the dangers of the old life. And now we'd like to encourage you and ask you to face in the direction of new life, to take this as the goal of life, to take this as our purpose in life, to orientate ourselves towards the new life that is free of selfishness. The new life is the life in which selfishness has been extinguished, in which selfishness has been stopped. So the thing that we must always keep in mind, which we must never forget, is the heart of Buddhism. We must always keep the heart of Buddhism in mind. And this heart of Buddhism is very simply dukkha and the end of dukkha, the cessation, the extinction of dukkha, or suffering. This cessation, the extinction of suffering, is what's most important. Suffering is all over the place. It's obvious and clear. The thing that we need to be particularly interested in is the extinction, the end, the cessation of pain and suffering, of dukkha. And the way to do this is to extinguish selfishness. This is the heart of Buddhism. It's very simple. The extinction of suffering by extinguishing selfishness. This is what we should always keep in mind. To express this heart of Buddhism a bit more concisely, we can say that if there is attachment to things, then there is suffering. When there is no attachment to anything, then there is no suffering. We can try and express it even a little more concisely than this. We can say, if attachment, then dukkha. If no attachment, no dukkha. This is the heart of Buddhism. The Buddha himself declared that I teach only dukkha and the complete extinction of dukkha. This is all that the Buddha taught. These things about birth and rebirth and future lives and past lives and things like that were taught way before the Buddha. And these things are not what Buddhism is about. These are unnecessary. They're something that we need not spend our time on. The essential matter is merely this thing of dukkha and the end of dukkha. We're born in this world and there is dukkha. This is something we can all be very certain about. And dukkha has a way of arising, and there is a way to extinguish dukkha. This has nothing to do with future lives or rebirth. It has merely to do with this life right here. This is what Buddhism is about, this life here and now. Dukkha exists, and there is the way that it arises, and there is the way to extinguish it. This is what we're interested in. We even dare to say that no matter what your religion, no matter what religion you claim to follow or you proclaim as your own, we challenge you by saying that no matter what religion you hold, dukkha arises in this way and it is extinguished in this way. That's all there is to it. This is the matter that we ask you to keep in mind, to reflect on, to make this truth very clear, bright, and apparent in your minds in order to free your lives from dukkha, no matter what religion you follow. This is the essential matter of life. This is the duty of life. We'd like to talk about something that may be a bit difficult for you to understand. But please listen carefully and try to understand what we're talking about. There's a thing that is called the good, or goodness, or sometimes we talk about the best. Some people value this very highly and go so far as to claim as the good is God, or goodness is God, the highest thing. We'd like to point out that this thing called goodness, that good, is the basis of attachment. That if we cling to good, like we generally do, then it turns into selfishness. This thing we call the good, or the best, we attach to it, we cling to it. This leads to us becoming good crazy or drunk on good, crazy about good. We become infatuated with good. We get lost in it, sink into it, and drowned in good. And this becomes selfishness. This goodness, or the good, the best, is the base of attachment. It becomes the basis and cause of selfishness. And so we need to take a good look at this. Please reflect on this thing that you call good, or goodness, or the best. If we're not careful with it, it leads to attachment. We'd like to look at this carefully in order to be free of good, to be void of good, to no longer be trapped and enslaved by good. And so we'll look at this thing, the good. These words may go against your feelings. They may not sit very well with you. Because for most of us, this goodness is what we value the most. Whether goodness or better or the best, the utmost goodness, all of these fall under the sway of positivism, which is the thing that just about everybody worships. Everybody is worshiping positivism and hating negativism. And so these words about the good and the best probably grate against your feelings and opinions. But for those who are interested in being free of suffering and free of selfishness, we must understand this business of positivism and negativism and learn to be free of them both, to no longer be trapped by them, to be empty of both positivism and negativism. We're not sure. Maybe these words are too strange for you to understand. But please try. If you can understand what it is we're talking about, if you can truly be free of positivism and negativism, then your lives will be empty of suffering and selfishness. So please give your full attention to this subject. In the world, in the ordinary world, they're only teaching about two things: positivism and negativism. They don't know anything more than this. They don't know anything beyond this. All they can talk about is positive and negative. And so worldlings, common ordinary people, are worshiping positivism. They're getting enslaved to it. They become infatuated with positivism and become enslaved and trapped by it. This has nothing to do with freedom. This is very far from being liberated. Just to get free of what is low and evil, this is not to be really free. To pass beyond evil and get to what is good, and then get trapped and caught in good, is not to be free. It is just slavery to the good. This is not liberation. For true liberation, we must go beyond evil and then go beyond good, and even go beyond the best. Transcend all this in order to be above, beyond both the positive and the negative. When there is still self, ego, the sense that I am, then the mind is enslaved to positivism and negativism. But when the mind drops this egoistic thinking, it transcends even the positive, even the best, and then there is liberation. When the mind is still trapped by dualistic pairs, by the pairs of opposites, by any of these pairs, then it is not free and empty. Whether it's the pair of positive and negative, or optimism and pessimism, or plus and minus, or any of these dualisms, then the mind is trapped and is not free. To be truly liberated, to be truly emancipated and saved, the mind must go beyond even the positive in order to be free. For those of you who have Christian backgrounds or Judeo-Christian backgrounds, we'd like you to think back to the most important teaching in the whole Bible, the most special and wonderful teaching, which is also the heart of Buddhism within the Christian Bible. Please remember the first teaching which God gave to Adam and Eve, which was the warning to do not eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is the first thing that God taught to man, to not eat this tree, eat the fruit of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because when we know good, then we attach to it. When we know evil, then we attach to it. And then we become enslaved to good and evil. We become trapped by positivism and negativism. Right in the very first chapter of Genesis, there is this warning from God himself. Not indirectly through Jesus Christ, but directly from God, the very first teaching given to mankind. Whenever the child begins to know about good and evil, then attachment arises to these things, and then the child's mind is enslaved and trapped by these conditions. And it gets trapped within all the dualistic pairs. So if you come from a Christian background, please be a true Christian. Don't be just a pseudo-Christian. And practice this teaching which God gave at the very beginning, to not attach to good and evil. Otherwise you will die. It's pretty funny that this teaching is actually the only direct quote of God in the entire Bible, whether the New Testament or the Old Testament. This is the only place where God speaks directly to mankind. And the words are very simply, don't attach to good and evil. It's right there in the first chapter of Genesis. This is the only time God spoke directly to man. And still, Adam and Eve didn't believe it. And so they went and ate that fruit, and the result is what we call original sin. From that original sin arose death, spiritual death, which in Buddhism we call dukkha, suffering. From this original teaching, God warned about attaching to good and evil. If man were willing to listen to God's warning, we would just see that things are happening naturally according to the law of nature, the law of itapajayata. Things just happen according to causes and conditions. It's merely a natural process. And in that process, there is nothing that can actually be called a self. But when the idea of self arises, when this foolish illusion arises, then man begins to react to things according to our own feelings in terms of this self. And things that the self likes are classified as good. And things which the self dislikes are classified as evil. And so out of this illusion of self arises the mistaken understanding, the knowledge of good and evil. And from this attachment, life becomes trapped in all kinds of dualisms and suffering. But by just seeing that things are happening naturally, by realizing that there is no self, then this problem can be avoided and life will be free. This is the new life, seeing that there is no self, and so we can be, the mind is above good and evil. Now let's look at our own lives, these lives that are attaching to both good and evil, which are trapped by this dualism. All of this happens because of the belief in self. This attachment to self is the basis of good and evil. This is the cause of good and evil. This is the fundamental source of the dualism of good and evil. Good and evil only have value to the self, to this illusion of self, but they have no real value in themselves. But when there is this idea of self, then what is pleasing to the self is judged to be good, and what is unpleasing or unpleasant is judged to be bad. It's merely that, just attachments arising from the attachment to self. And from this arises all the dualities, all the positivism and negativism, pessimism and optimism in which our lives are trapped. This is the old life. This is the life in which we suffer. We need to understand this thing we call life, this life which we take and attach to and turn into suffering. Really, all there is just the 5 khandhas, the 5 aggregates, which we discussed yesterday. All that life is the functioning of these 5 khandhas, the various khandhas performing their duties. That is what life is, and nothing more. But when ignorance leads to attachment, then we take these various khandhas to be the self. And this illusion is what creates all the problems. In reality, it's just the natural functioning of these khandhas. But the ignorant mind takes, for example, when the body performs its duty, then the mind says, I. Say the body moves, the mind thinks, I move. I move. Or when there is a feeling in the mind, I feel. The ego feels. This is my feeling. Or when the mind performs the function of discrimination, I discriminate. The mind thinks. There is the illusion that I think, or when there is knowing of the sense objects, there is the illusion that the ego, the self, knows. Really, it's just the natural functioning of these khandhas. But as soon as the self comes in, when there is a self, the idea of self arises in terms of these five functions, then this leads to further foolishness and stupidity. This basic stupidity of self grows into the attachments to good and evil, positive and negative, and all these other attachments which entraps life. So we need to look at and understand life and understand this thing that we call the self, this illusion, this delusion that is imposed upon the five khandhas. I'd like to stress this point about the attachment to the functioning of the five khandhas, that this self-idea clings to these five functions, and this arises the idea of self. This all is happening because of ignorance, because of not understanding the way things really are. When there is this basic ignorance arising to the illusion of self, then this self is taken to be permanent. This temporary fleeting idea of self is clung to and taken to be something solid and permanent. And then from this, we don't see impermanence. Rather, we see permanence in things. And we don't see the unsatisfactoriness in things. We see them as satisfying. And we see all things as selves because of this fundamental ignorance. Instead of seeing the impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self of phenomena, they are taken to be permanent, satisfying, beautiful, and selves. They're taken to be permanent little entities, individual entities. This is all arising from the fundamental ignorance of our own clinging to things as I and mine. But if the mind can begin to see things, see the working of the five khandhas as impermanent, unsatisfactory, in non-self, then this chain, this process can be stopped and the mind can become free. This is what we will go into next. So this brings up three most important things that all of us need to understand completely and clearly. These we can call the three characteristics, or three truths, or three facts, whatever. These are three characteristics of the five khandha. And when they are characteristics of the khandha, the aggregates, then they are the characteristics or facts of life. The first characteristic is impermanence. The five khandhas, or life, is always changing. It's flowing. Nothing stays still for even a moment. This is impermanence, this constant flux and flow. When things are always changing like this, they can't stay still. They can't maintain themselves in any state or form. Nothing can stay in one form. And this means that it is difficult to endure or bear. And this is what is meant by dukkha. And when things are difficult to bear, impossible to stand up to, that means that there is no self, there is no real self that can stand up and stop that change. There is no self that can prevent that change, that can stand that dukkha. And this is the third characteristic, the characteristic of not self. There is no self in any way, shape, or form. So these are the three characteristics of the five khandha, or of life, that we all must know. Everything is changing, is impermanent. that change is very difficult to bear. And there is nothing which can stop it or control it. These are the three characteristics of life: impermanence, anicca, unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, and not self, anatta. The first thing to observe, to realize, is that there is merely a process of cause and effect, a process of conditioning. And in that process, there is no self. All that is taking place is a series, a process of causes, conditioning effects, causes leading to effects. Various things cooking up, conditioning, compounding other things. This is a process, a flow that is taking place. And if we observe it carefully, we just see it as a natural process happening under the law of itapacayata, the law of nature. And in all that, there is no self. There are merely these conditioned things, these phenomena, arising and passing away. And in this process, further conditioning and cooking up other phenomena. And this process just goes on and on. But there is no self anywhere to be found. This is the first thing to realize. And then it is possible to realize the end of selfishness. If we look closely at life, if we look at this operation of the 5 khandhas, we'll see that life is just this flow, just this process of changing things, arising and passing away, arising and passing away. See that in the operation, the functioning of these 5 khandhas, there is just this process, this natural process, and that each of the 5 khandhas, each of these functions, is completely empty of self. There is no self in there. They're just natural functions. And these 5 functions which make up life, that is empty of self. If this is reflected on, contemplated, and seen most clearly, then the mind can be freed from this illusion that there is such a thing as a self. Merely close your eyes and observe. Stop thinking about it all, but just observe this process of change, this process of these 5 khandhas arising to perform a function and then passing away. Observe this natural process and see that nowhere is there any self. It is merely natural things, natural functions and phenomena operating according to the law of nature. When this is seen, then the mind is freed of that delusion of self, and it stops cooking up all these fantastic ideas about good and evil, beautiful and ugly, positive and negative, pessimism, optimism and pessimism. The mind that is empty of self, that sees the emptiness of the 5 khandhas. This mind no longer cooks up all these delusions. It's no longer attached to all these deluded ideas, thoughts, and feelings. And then that mind is free. So just close your eyes and observe this process, this empty, selfless process. The next thing is a little bit more difficult to understand, but please give it your fullest attention. In the functioning of these 5 khandha, all of these empty, selfless khandha, in their functioning, one of the khandhas in particular, sanya khandha, the perception, recognition, discrimination aggregate. Sometimes the way this one works is it perceives things as selves. When this khandha is working in this deluded way, in this ignorant way, then it gives rise to their perception, the classification of things as self. This illusion of self is just this one function of the sanya khandha, and that's all. And when Sanya Kanda, sometimes it perceives itself as self. Sanya Kanda classifies Sanya Kanda as self or as myself. And then it discriminates or classifies the various other khandas as selves or belonging to self, depending on which one is functioning in the circumstances. That's all. There are these 5 khandas functioning, but Sanya Kanda, because of this illusion, goes and perceives self in the functioning of the individual khandas, or sometimes takes life as a whole to be a self, and then projects selfhood on other external things. But this is all arising out of ignorance. So the only thing that can be done, the thing that we must do, is to wisen up, to bring wisdom into the operation of this Sanya Kanda, to stop perceiving things as self, to develop the wisdom and understanding that things are. So the only thing that can be done, the thing that we must do, is to wisen up, to bring wisdom into the operation of this Sanya Kanda, to stop perceiving things as self, to develop the wisdom and understanding that things are not self. And then this can correct the functioning of Sanya Kanda so that this illusion is no longer applied to the 5 khandas or to life. The way to extinguish or destroy selfishness is to get rid of this attachment to things as self, to see that each of the 5 khandas are neither self, that they do not belong to self, that in them there is no selfhood or anything of that sort. To see that the 5 khandas are completely empty of self. This will destroy the illusion of self, and that in turn will destroy selfishness. This is a very simple, fundamental principle. The way to get rid of selfishness is to get rid of this illusion of selfhood. And this is why we study the 5 khandas, in order to see that they are merely natural functions which are free of any self. This is a fundamental principle which you must try very hard to understand and then see, realize, observe it in nature, in life. Another thing which would be wise to observe is that as soon as we talk about extinguishing selfishness, just about everybody starts to complain that I can't do that. That's beyond me. I can't live without selfishness. Just about everybody reacts in this way. And then when we talk about extinguishing the belief in self, then people really complain. They complain that it's impossible, that they can't do it, and they become afraid. Because just about everybody is so attached to this idea of self that they think by extinguishing this that they would die. And so everybody becomes afraid of this, these words, this teaching. And the more attached to good, to goodness that someone is, the more afraid they are. The more lost and attached and enslaved to things they value, the more afraid they are of this truth. And so they complain and they try not to pay attention and they argue and all of those things. This is something that happens with everyone, and so it's worth observing. In the texts, it says that the devas, the divine beings, the heavenly lives, are the most afraid of not self. The better that life is, the better one's life is, the higher, more happy and exalted one's life is, the more one is afraid of not self. The different ideas about heavenly beings and so forth, about divine lives, these are the ones that are most afraid because their lives are so nice, so beautiful, that they're so good, that they become very attached to this goodness. And that just leads to being afraid. The better off we are, the more good we have, the more attached to it we become. And this leads to fear. This is a problem that we must correct, because it makes it impossible for us to lead our lives in a way that is new life. All this goodness that just inspires and incites attachment makes it impossible to live a new life, to end selfishness. So this is a problem to look at and realize and then correct. Another fact that we need to consider is this thing we call the instinct of self, this fundamental instinct that of there being a self. This instinct is very powerful, and it is difficult to overcome it. And for many of us, it would seem impossible. But there is one way we can deal with it. And this is that if this instinct is operating, then be very careful with it. Keep it under control so that there is this self, but don't let it be selfish. If you still value this instinct of self, then at least don't let it become selfish. Keep it under control. Remember that in truth, this instinct is not really true. It's a bit foolish and ignorant. It serves the purpose of survival, of allowing life to survival, but it's not actually true. If we can use this understanding to keep this instinct under control so it doesn't become defilement, doesn't lead to greed, anger, confusion, and so forth, then it can become a self that is not selfish. This is a technique that we can all use. This to use that instinct of self, that is, and not let it become selfishness. And then life can continue. We will survive. We will continue living, but not selfishly. And by doing this, then we can begin to apply the knowledge that comes from concentration, insight, meditation. By using the powers of concentration and insight, it will become possible to see the reality of this instinct. If we can keep that instinct under control enough to have a peaceful and calm enough life to practice meditation, then it will be possible for the knowledge to arise from the practice of concentration and insight, that self is just a creation of the mind. It's just a conditioned thing, just a phenomena, an idea arising and passing away in the mind. And then this knowledge can be developed, then the mind can be completely freed of selfishness. This instinct of self can follow two paths. It can either take the path of enlightenment or bodhi, or it can take the path of kilesa, of defilement. If the instincts are controlled and kept so that they are correct, especially this instinct of self, if it is kept from being selfish, then it will stay correct, and it will follow the path of bodhi, of awakening or enlightenment. And then in doing so, it is possible to eventually realize the truth that all things are not self. We have to prevent the instincts from following the lower path, the path of kilesa, because these instincts have a tendency to just follow the things which entice it, which lure it, all the delicious, attractive, exciting, beautiful, enjoyable things in the world. These are always luring the instincts towards defilement, towards selfishness. And so there is this tendency to take things as self, to attach and to become selfish. So we must be very careful with the instincts to maintain them in a way that is correct, so that they follow the path of awakening. If they go on this low path, that's just the common, cheap, ordinary life. Many people are willing to surrender to the instincts and allow them to become defiled. Many people aren't willing to put forth the effort to control the instincts and live in the higher way. Most people are willing, they give up and surrender and let the instincts chase after beautiful, delicious, attractive, fun things. But if life is to be correct and freed from selfishness, these instincts must be controlled and led along the path of bodhi, of awakening. Before we end today's talk, we'd like to remind you of a metaphor which we used a few days ago. This is a metaphor that describes the life in which there is self, the life of attachment, of clinging to self. In this life, it's like there is a rope around one's neck, pulling one upward. And there is another rope around our feet, pulling us downward. And then there is a fire scorching us in the belly, the fire of greed, the fire of hatred, burning and scorching our gut. Please reflect on this metaphor of the life of attachment, the life of self and selfishness. There's a noose around the neck, pulling upward, and another rope around the feet, pulling one downward. And in the middle are these very painful fires of lust and hatred, burning one's guts. If you reflect on this metaphor of the life of attachment and selfishness, you'll begin to see the pain inherent in such a life, in this old life. And when you begin to see the pain of the life of attachment, you'll start to think about, you'll seriously consider removing this illusion of self, getting rid of the self and selfishness. So please use this metaphor and reflect upon it and see the life of attachments, see selfish life as it truly is. The rope around the neck, another around the feet, pulling one apart, and the fires of lust and hatred scorching one in the middle. And then you'll begin to have some genuine interest in a new life, a life that is free of self and selfishness. We'll end today's talk with this metaphor because time is up. In the first talk, we talked about the dangers of selfishness. And then in the second talk, we discussed the cause of selfishness as well as the foundations of selfishness. In yesterday's talk, we talked about the extinguishing of selfishness. Today, we will discuss the benefits, the value of extinguishing selfishness. We speak about the fruit or benefits of extinguishing selfishness. We'd like to bring up one Thai word which ought to be of interest to you. In Thai, this word is anisong, which comes from the Pali word anisangsa. The meaning of this word is the milk that flows out of, the flowing milk. When we milk a cow, then the milk, the nutritious milk, flows out from the cow's utter. This is the literal meaning of the word anisong. So today we'll talk about the anisong of extinguishing selfishness. When we talk about the anisong of getting rid of selfishness, the most simple way to put it is to say that happiness is the benefit of extinguishing selfishness. But when we use this word happiness, we must be a bit careful because happiness is a very vague and uncertain word. People give it all kinds of different meanings. And so we will clarify what is meant by the word happiness. We'll take a good look at this word. At first we can at least see that there are two kinds of happiness. The happiness of everyday people language and the happiness of Dhamma language. The word happiness in people language, by people language we mean the common everyday meaning in terms of people and persons. In people language, happiness is something that we can get drunk on, we can become infatuated with it, go crazy over it, get lost in it, and this is very important, it bites its owner. This is the happiness of people language, the happiness that is intoxicating, infatuating, very tricky, and which in the end bites its owner. If we look closely, this happiness in people, the happiness of people language, this common, ordinary happiness, isn't true happiness. What it really is a kind of pleasure which deceives and tricks. It's a kind of entertaining, luscious, attractive pleasure which deceives. This is what most people take to be happiness. This tricky pleasure, this deceiving pleasure, is always ready to become a bait. It's always ready to become bait to catch us and trap us. And so all the worldlings who are chasing after these deceptive pleasures are being trapped by this bait. And this is the state of worldlings, being deceived and lured by the bait of worldly pleasure or deceptive pleasures. This is happiness in people language. This worldly happiness is always something material and physical. It depends on bodies and material objects. It's not a mental or spiritual kind of happiness. And therefore this kind of deceptive pleasures are very expensive. They're very difficult, and they're a real pain in the neck to acquire and to keep. And so it leads to all kinds of busyness, competition, and problems for the worldlings who are chasing after this worldly happiness. And the last point to be made about this people language happiness is that it is the basis of selfishness. As soon as people indulge in these deceptive pleasures, it becomes selfishness and creates all the problems associated with selfishness. Now let's look at the opposite kind of happiness. This happiness is not intoxicating or infatuating. It doesn't make us crazy, and it doesn't bite the one who possesses it. It doesn't bite the one who has it. Be very careful about this point. This kind of happiness is not a deceptive pleasure. It doesn't trick or deceive. But The ordinary worldling overlooks it. Common people overlook this genuine, true happiness. So let's take a good look at it. This kind of happiness is not a bait. It doesn't lure us and trap us. This genuine happiness is pure, bright, clear, calm, and it leads to peace. It is not a bait which entraps or deceives. This kind of happiness isn't at all expensive. It doesn't cost any money or any material difficulties. There are no hassles and problems associated with this kind of happiness. It's free. And the most important point is that this kind of happiness does not lead to selfishness. It does not support or nourish selfishness. In Thai, there's a very nice pun. The word sukh, which means happiness, has two spellings. One spelling means happiness, and the other spelling means well done. Both kinds of sukh have the same sound and pronunciation, but the meaning is different. And so we use this to point out the difference between the two kinds of happiness. Genuine happiness is cool and calm. It doesn't lead to selfishness. The false kind of happiness, which means well done, is hot. So the easiest way to translate this into English is hot happiness and cool happiness. This hot happiness is dependent on the defilements, greed, anger, delusion, and so forth. It needs their help in order to be happy. Cool happiness has nothing to do with the defilements. It doesn't need their help at all. For hot happiness to realize its aim, it needs to use and get help from the defilements. And this is why it's hot. But genuine cool happiness has nothing to do with the defilements. It doesn't need their help, and so it can be very cool and soothing. This hot happiness depends on all kinds of material goods. And when people become infatuated with this kind of defiled happiness, then they set about trying to acquire possessions, material objects, and all kinds of luxuries. This is the kind of happiness with which the world is infatuated. Everyone chasing after various kinds of luxuries, spending all kinds of money in pursuit of what they take to be happiness, this hot, deceptive happiness. The other kind of happiness, cool happiness, doesn't cost a penny or a pfennig or a mark or whatever currency. It costs absolutely nothing for this kind of happiness. It's a mental, spiritual happiness which has nothing to do with material things. And so when one overcomes selfishness, or when one is able to concentrate the mind correctly, when one practices mindfulness of breathing correctly and properly, then there arises this genuine, cool happiness which doesn't deceive or trick, and it doesn't cost a penny. So if we talk in economic terms, there is the happiness that costs money and the happiness that doesn't cost a penny. Which one are you interested in? Now that we've made it clear the difference between hot and cool happiness, we'd like to focus on the happiness of Dhamma, this cool happiness. Even though we can say the happiness of Dhamma, there are different levels to it, or there are different kinds of Dhammic happiness with different qualities and characteristics. So we'd like to talk about these different levels of true happiness. The first level of Dhammic happiness is the happiness that comes from non-harming or non-violence. When there is no harm being done, then there arises this first kind of happiness. In Pali, there is the phrase, apayapachang sukhang loke.
Pana putesu.
Pana putesu
sanyamo.
sanyamo.
จำไว้ได้ก็ดีถ้าจำไม่ได้ก็ดี
Apayapacha sukhang loke.
Pana putesu sanyamo.
This means that non-harming is happiness within this world. When we live here with aware that we are not harming ourselves, any other people, any other creatures, or the environment, when we are aware of a life and lifestyle that is not harming anything, is not exploiting or violating anything, then there arises this first kind of happiness. With this word, non-harming or harming, we have to be very careful. Many people take a one-sided view of it. When we talk about harm, there are two sides of it. One is we can harm ourselves, and the other is harm others. When there is genuine non-harming, neither side is harmed or violated. There is nobody is being afflicted. But sometimes we get confused on this, and in order to help others, we harm ourselves. And then, of course, there is often the kind of helping oneself by harming or exploiting others. But in true non-harming, true non-violence, there is no harming of either ourselves or others. When there is this complete non-harming, then there arises genuine happiness. We like to say that the more one loves oneself, the more one harms oneself. Or the more one is selfish, the more one harms oneself. When one loves oneself, this love makes us blind, and then we indulge in those deceptive pleasures which lead us astray. We go through all kinds of ridiculous difficulties to get some trifling pleasure. And this is how we harm ourselves, because of this self-love. The more stupid we are, the more we harm ourselves. And when there's this stupid, foolish self-love, then we harm ourselves immensely, wasting our time on these trifling, deceptive pleasures and overlooking true happiness. And so the more selfish we are, the more we harm ourselves. When we come to harming others, we probably don't have to say very much about it, because the world is full of this. People, selfishness, leading to people harming others for their own selfish benefit. When we selfishly see something as beneficial or advantageous to ourselves, then we're completely willing to go and take advantage of someone else to exploit or harm another for our own advantage. And the world is full of this. There's this exploitation all around, underground, above ground, in small ways and in big ways, such that people are even trying to take advantage of the whole world. Sometimes we cut the world into two halves, and each half is trying to harm the other half. Or sometimes we try and harm the whole world, and this exploitation and affliction sometimes even starts to think about other worlds, to go over and conquer other planets and worlds in order to take advantage of those worlds. This kind of selfish harming knows no limits. It's limitless. When there is no selfishness, then nothing is harmed. Merely by removing selfishness, all this violence and exploitation can be destroyed. When there is no selfishness, we don't harm ourselves. There's no harming of others. Even the animals are not harmed. We can even go so far as saying that even the ground, the soil, the earth is not harmed when selfishness is removed. When this selfishness is extinguished, and there is none of this harming, then it becomes very natural to relate to others in terms of what are called the divine dwellings: friendliness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And then this is the basis for Dhammic happiness. Those of you who value this teaching of the four divine abodes, Metta, Karuna, Mudita, and Upekkha, you should focus on this one thing of removing selfishness. If you are interested in Metta, universal love or friendliness, Karuna, compassion, Mudita, sympathetic joy, and Upekkha, equanimity, then all you need to do is direct your attention to unselfishness or selflessness. When there is no selfishness, then there is Metta automatically. There is this very spontaneous love for everything. There is spontaneous Karuna, the desire to help, to be of service, or compassion. There is spontaneous joy at the happiness of others. And there is Upekkha, when it is not possible to help at this moment, then with Upekkha it's to await the opportunity to help and serve. Some people understand this last divine abode incorrectly. They take Upekkha to mean to be indifferent. To be indifferent when we can't do anything to help. But true Upekkha is to observe and await an opportunity to help, if there's no opportunity right at this moment. So if you value these four Brahma Viharas, four divine abodes, then focus your attention on not being selfish. This last Brahma Vihara, Upekkha, is often a source of confusion. Upekkha means to look at, to observe, to watch. Some people think it means to close our eyes and not pay attention, to be indifferent. That's silly and of no value or benefit. Upekkha means to look at, to observe. If everyone in the world would keep looking for opportunities to help others, for opportunities to serve others, then there wouldn't be any of these crises in the world that there is these days. So please be especially interested in Upekkha, looking, observing for opportunities to help and serve. This is the fundamental or basic level of happiness that arises when there is no harming, neither harming oneself or anyone or anything else. Then there arises this fundamental kind of happiness. This happiness arises when there is no harming, and that comes from not being selfish. At first this may seem illogical to you, that by not being selfish there arises happiness. Many people have the warped kind of logic that by being selfish we become happy. By being selfish we help ourselves. But this betrays a fundamental ignorance about life. When we remove, it may sound illogical, but by removing selfishness, when there is no selfishness, this is what benefits us. This is what is to our advantage. If we look carefully, we see that it's selfishness which burns our minds, so that even if we're all by ourselves, this selfishness is constantly disturbing us, so that we can't even sleep well at night. And this constantly thinking of oneself, thinking in terms of oneself, this egocentricity, gives us all kinds of headaches. It leads to all sorts of neuroses. It makes us go crazy, even to the point that many people are killing themselves because of selfishness. This sounds strange to many people, that suicide is essentially a selfish act. But this is because selfishness in itself is very stupid, And so it leads to all kinds of stupid and ignorant results, including suicide. If you study all the suicides in the world, if you look beyond the superficial causes and look really deep, you'll see the fundamental cause of suicide is selfishness. Selfishness leads to not being able to sleep at night. Egocentrism leads to headaches and neuroses. Selfishness even leads to harming ourselves in such an extreme way as suicide. The only way to stop harming ourselves is to end selfishness. As long as there is selfishness, we harm ourselves and others. This is something you really ought to examine as carefully as you can. And now we'll come to the second level of Dhammic happiness. This is the happiness that comes from being without lust. When there is no lust, the absence of lust is a higher level of happiness. Everyone knows what lust means. To remove lust, to remove sexual greed and sensual greed is a higher kind of happiness. In Bali, there are the words virak,
สุขาวิราคตาโลเกกามานังสมติกัมโมสุขาวิราคตาโลเกกามานังสมติกัมโม
which means by eliminating lust within the world or towards the world, this surpasses the happiness that comes from being free of lust towards the world, surpasses the happiness of sensuality. This is a higher kind of happiness. When the mind is free of this sensual lust, then it is even more happier, calmer, and cooler. This word lust has a broader meaning than most people understand. And though this may be a little bit beyond your immediate needs, we'd like to mention it. Most people think that lust has only to do with sex or things related to sex. This is the narrow understanding of the word lust, or in Thai the word raka, which can mean also passion, a very passionate, excited kind of love. But lust has a much broader meaning than that. Sexual lust is only the first level. There can be also lust towards material objects, which isn't so much a sensual lust, but just the lust to possess, to have material things. And then there's an even third level of lust, which doesn't have much to do with material, physical things. The lust for power, for influence, for fame, for honor, and things like this, for immaterial things. This is also a kind of lust. So try and understand the word lust in this broader way. And when all three kinds or levels of lust can be removed, then there is a very great happiness in being free of these levels of lust. But even if you can just remove the crudest sexual kind of lust, by being free of that lust is in itself a great deal of happiness. The stronger that selfishness is, the stronger lust will be. And as selfishness decreases and lessens, then lust also abates and decreases. So the more powerful and strong selfishness is, the more powerful lust is and all its agitation. But by lessening and eliminating selfishness, then there can arise the happiness of being free of lust. So once again, by lessening and overcoming selfishness, then there comes the higher level of happiness that is being without, that is to live without lust. Often people teach that the way to remove lust, to overcome lust, is to contemplate repulsive things, to contemplate ugly and loathsome things. So it's often advised to people with a lot of lust to go to a cemetery or cremation ground and contemplate the corpses or the remains of corpses. These various quite unattractive and repulsive things are a traditional technique for lessening lust. Now, that's right in its own way. It's correct and it can help. But the most efficient and powerful way to eliminate lust is to remove selfishness. Because even going to the cemetery, if that includes any selfishness, then still there will be kinds of lust. There will be some lust remaining. So the best way to eliminate lust is to eliminate selfishness. If you want to contemplate corpses or other unattractive, repulsive things to help the removing of selfishness, that might be a good idea. But the essential thing is to remove selfishness. By removing selfishness, then there is nothing on which lust can stand. Selfishness is the basis, the foundation of lust. If we take away that basis, then there could be no lust. So this is the best way to be free of lust, by becoming free of selfishness. So the second kind of happiness is that which comes when we are free of lust. This is the kind of happiness that arises because the mind or life is no longer disturbed and hassled by lust. Often we can't sleep well at night because of lust in either a cruder or more refined form. Lust keeps us from sleeping well at night, or sometimes it prevents us from sleeping at all. And it can disturb us, hassle us throughout the day. This kind of lust exists, and there is also a way of removing it, merely by removing selfishness. And then there arises this second level of happiness, the happiness of being without raga, without lust. Now we come to the third level of happiness, or the last level of happiness. This is the happiness of being completely free of all selfishness, when all selfishness is absolutely and completely removed, eliminated, extinguished. This is the kind of happiness that surpasses the world. This happiness is above the world. It is not trapped within worldly conditions. When there is absolutely no selfishness, then there can arise no defilements. When there is no selfishness, then the mind is beyond the world. It's no longer caught within the world. And so worldly conditions, there's nothing in the world that can have influence over the mind. There's nothing in the world that can make the mind greedy or angry or hateful or afraid or worried or any other kind of defiled reactions. The mind is free of all these things. And this is the kind of happiness which is above the world, or which surpasses the world. The Pali sentence which expresses this third kind of happiness is asami mano manatsa vinayo etang we paramang sukhang. Asami manatsa vinayo etang we paramang sukhang. What this means is, by leading or by removing asami mana. By removing asami mana, there is removing asami mana completely is the highest happiness. Why? We'll have to explain a few of these words. Asami mana, you've been hearing about over and over again. This is to regard things as I, as me, as mine, as self. So by removing self-view, by removing the idea that there is a self, personality belief, whatever you want to call it, I, self, soul, ego, no matter what name you call it, it's the basis of selfishness. By removing the belief in self, the view of self, this is the highest, the supreme happiness. Why? The word why means something like
interjection
means something like hooray or hurrah. It's a cry of victory when a supreme accomplishment has been accomplished, when there is the highest kind of victory and success, then in Thai the kind of call would be woi, or something like that. So, removing all self-view is the highest happiness. Hooray. But woi is a lot more than hooray. It's